generalizado.
The colorful streets of this neighborhood are full with layers of history. Once it was home to El Tostado or Don Tosti.
He was the first Mexican-American musician to sell more than 1 million records, and he was a pachuco.
But there's someone else who lived inside the red brick apartment building we're standing in front of, whose legacy and history has not always been widely celebrated. In this exact apartment once lived Theresa Urrea, a Mexican revolutionary, a curandera or healer, and a feminist.
She was everything. She was a curandera, she was a newspaper editor. I mean, so many people were drawn to her charisma that literally hundreds of people would set up tents in front of her home there.
In 1896, Theresa Urrea moved to El Paso. People loved her. They worshipped her like a saint.
Teresita became a symbol of a forgotten history that was utterly fascinating. I mean, she was like the Selena of her time.
Back in 2006, the city of El Paso approved a plan to demolish Segundo Barrio, the same neighborhood where Theresa Urrea healed hundreds of people in the 1800s. Theresa Urrea was a curandera who used herbs and traditional indigenous healing methods. But there are also various accounts of Theresa having a special power. She could heal through her touch. In the late 19th century, Theresa was a star. Aside from people believing she was a saint, her vision of love and equality inspired rebellions in Mexico against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. But with time, her miraculous life got erased from history books and museums. To understand the story of Theresa Urrea is to understand what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. Two historians, David Romo and Yolanda Leiva, were part of a resistance movement to the city's demolition plan. They created Museo Urbano, a space to celebrate the legacy of Segundo Barrio. The museum included an exhibition in the very same apartment where Theresa once lived. Today, Theresa Urrea, who at 19 years old was once called the most dangerous girl in Mexico by the dictator Porfirio Diaz. Our producer, Maria Skincan, is going to take it from here.
Theresa Urrea was born in 1873 in the lush green state of Sinaloa, Mexico. Her mother, Cayetana Chavez, was an indigenous woman. She worked in the ranch of Don Tomás Urrea, a tall, light-skinned, rich hacendado with Spanish lineage, notorious for his wandering eye. Cayetana was just 14 years old when she gave birth to Teresita, the daughter of Tomás Urrea.
So if we're looking at it from the perspective of society back then, 14 is a pretty common age to get married and to start having children.
This is Yolanda again, a Chicana historian at the University of Texas at El Paso. She specializes in border history.
What is not different is that power relationship, that he's her employer.
In an interview, Theresa said she was an illegitimate child. She was one of 19 children Don Tomás Urrea had outside of his marriage. As a child, Teresita must have stood out as a mestiza. She's described as having light skin, large brown eyes, and long black hair. In 1880, when Theresa was 7 years old, Porfirio Diaz's first term as president of Mexico was ending. A military general, he came into office by staging a coup and reigned over Mexico for more than 30 years. The general would shape the course of Teresa's life. Porfirio Diaz's time in office is known as the Porfiriato. He ruled with an iron fist and secured his presidency by installing his supporters in positions of power. His opponents were sometimes assassinated.
And he basically controlled the whole shebang, all of Mexico, through corruption, through just having just keeping good relations with the oligarchy in every different state.
This is David Romo again. He wrote about Theresa Urrea in Ringside Seat to a Revolution, his book about El Paso and Ciudad Juarez's connection to the Mexican Revolution. For all of her childhood and into her teenage years, Theresa grew up with her mother in separate quarters from the ranch. She grew up in poverty, surrounded by indigenous people like her mother. The more and more I read about Theresa, the more obsessed I became. There was something marvelous or otherworldly about her. The details that seeped in through newspapers, interviews, and archives were fascinating. Take this quote, for example, taken from an interview in the San Francisco Examiner in 1900, where she described how she learned to read.
Later I felt I wanted to learn how to read, and I learned my alphabet from a very, very old lady. My writing came to me of itself. I wanted to write and I wrote, but how I learned I don't know, for I was not taught. On the floor of my mother's house, I first wrote with my little finger in the dust.
The quotes you will hear of Theresa are taken from English newspaper articles. Theresa didn't speak English, so they are translations, and they are voiced by one of our producers, Victoria Estrada. When Theresa was 15 years old, her mother Cayetana disappeared. After her mother disappeared, Don Tomás Urrea ordered Theresa to move into the ranch with him. At her father's ranch, Theresa became an apprentice to Huila, a Yaqui Curandera who worked for her father. The Yaquis are an indigenous group in Sonora. Through Huila, Theresa learned how to heal by using plants, part of an indigenous traditional medicine practice known as curanderismo that predates the 16th century. Curanderismo refers to a system of healing practiced in Mexico, Latin America, and in places with large Mexican communities like the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Characteristics of curanderismo include ritual, Catholic prayer, the use of plants and herbs, and the belief in God or Creator. To become a curandera takes years of training. It's not something anyone can just pick up. It's a commitment that is taken very seriously.
So it's just like I wouldn't take a biology class and say, I'm a doctor now. People shouldn't call themselves a curandera if they have not really thoroughly trained and they have a teacher who has trained them.
Back in El Paso, I'm in the house of Gris Munoz.
My name is Gris Munoz.
A self-described mujer medicina or a curandera. Gris feels connected to Theresa. She has a picture of her in her altar.
I'm very connected to Teresita. She's been watching me a long time. And Teresita's still around. She hasn't gone anywhere.
Like Theresa, Gris was the apprentice of a curandera for years. Gris works with the spirit.
I'm not a midwife. I'm not a sobadora. I'm not a huesera. Women tend to find me when they've gotten themselves a bit lost. Maybe they just went through a major change. Maybe they need to accept something, a death of some type. That's really where I come in. I can't speak for all curanderos, but essentially, especially the ones that work with the spirit like I do, we're just here to help you reconnect.
Under her apprenticeship with Huila, Theresa learned the names and properties of more than 200 herbs. She followed Huila around while her teacher did things like helping women give birth or treating wounds and illnesses. Then, something happened to Theresa when she was 16 years old. There's varying accounts on the next set of events. Some accounts say Theresa had an epileptic seizure. Other reports say an engineering student tried to rape her, and it gave Theresa a shock-induced seizure. In either case, after losing consciousness, Theresa fell into a coma.
They think she's dead.
Teresa's father put his ear against her chest to listen for a heartbeat, but he couldn't hear anything. He ordered a coffin to be built. They prepared Theresa for a wake, dressed her in a white dress. They placed her body on a table and surrounded her body with candles.
So they make her a casket. And in el velorio, she wakes up. Everyone is like, we should.
After waking up, Theresa predicted that in 3 days they were going to need the coffin for someone else.
And then Willa died.
3 days later, Theresa's teacher was found in her room. It looked like she passed away peacefully. The cause of her death wasn't clear, but people speculated she died from old age or exhaustion.
And they buried Willa in the casket they had made for Teresita.
Coming up on